Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Today we have episode 117 Stitches in Distress, Weathered Logos and Embroidery. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. We are in for a fun little episode here today. Probably not a tremendous amount of content, probably a little bit of more debating involved in this one, but we're going to talk about how we deal with distress in embroidery. Just like I said previously in the description for this, if you're tuning in now, you know that all of us have had to handle embroidery art that comes in with distressing, that is destroyed, textured, scraped, stroked. It has something about it that has a texture that is not really conducive to embroidery. And it's something that I wanted to talk about briefly because I see people really stressing about how to handle it, stressing about which ways to deal with it, and especially having problems with things that are speckled or streaked in such a way that it's really hard to make them work with embroidery, either because we've got textural elements that are too small to render, or we've got things that we have trims between, that we have constant little trims and knots and issues that make them technically difficult for embroidery. The question remains for all of us, and I'm going to talk about this repeatedly throughout this day, throughout this episode, is to render or not to render? That is the question. Do we render that texture? Do we try and make that texture work for us? Or do we just create a version of the logo that doesn't have that issue? So, what I want to talk about today is essentially this problem. Do we render it? Do we not render it? And also a little bit of how we render it. What are the things that we're looking for that define something as distressed? And I'll also just show you some examples of things that we consistently deal with and talk about some real life examples from my own work and my own time doing like largely business to business work, logo work, the kind of technical geometric work that a lot of us do in embroidery that doesn't always work for this kind of stuff, that doesn't always make sense to put distressing on it. This is very frequently an issue where we go from print, where we're using techniques in print that are very specific to print that work very well in print, to the embroidery world, and quite often where we have issues with that. Kind of communicating the same sorts of textural nuance that we want. Embroidery is not necessarily made 100% for the same kind of work. So, like I said, we'll work on that. We'll talk about it as we go through. We'll certainly get some stories from you guys. I'm certainly hoping. And by the way, Mike says, I'm just here for the drippy puff paint logo. You know what? I was debating on putting that in there. Like while we're sitting here right now, sir, I will try and bring that up. I will try and put that in because I do love that one. I know it's one that I show it a lot of the time, but the drip logo is one of the ones that I like quite a bit. I think it's something that's worthwhile. I don't think that that's outside of the scope. Dealing with drips, with strings, it's actually something that's in my banners that I wanted to talk about. The different kind of things we can see in distressed logos certainly have to do with texture and show through and roughness, but one of them is drips, trailers, and strings. What do we do with that? And we can talk about that. I wasn't going to use that logo, but maybe later on I will bring that up because it is one that I do show pretty frequently, and people always ask me, what would you do if you had this logo that has graffiti with little dripped paint stringers? Yeah, it is a real thing. It is something that we have to render, and there's ways to handle it. We'll talk about it. Let's go ahead and talk to you guys and see some of the comments as you're listening in. Like I said, would love to have some interface with you guys. Jump in, tell me stories, talk about things you've had to deal with, logos that you had that had distressing, and how you decided to handle that distressed look. I'll also probably define distressing a little bit as we get through this as well. Let's say hi to a few people who are saying hi ahead of time. Barb says, hi, Eric. Hey, Takeup crew. Happy Friday. Happy Friday to you, Barb. Happy to have you here. Curtis is in saying hello. Hello, Curtis. Justin says, looking forward to this one. You probably have lots of insights on this, so feel free to chime in with the way you want to handle stuff. Justin, who is also a digitizer from jadigitizing.com. Mike, of course, is in since I already got him on the drippy puff paint logo. Yeah, I know. The puff logo with the drips always ends up showing. I'll have to bring that up. I wasn't going to, but I'll bring it up. And Frank from out in the UK, good evening, Frank. Thank you for being here as well. And yeah, I know. Some of my samples, I'm going to show. I need to make some new samples. That's what I'm hearing from you, sir. I need some new samples. I'll try not to take it negatively, but what I'm hearing from you is, hey, Eric, make some new samples, buddy. You don't always have to lean on the same stuff from that same logo from Knob Hill. So yeah, I know. I like that one. It is certainly one that I like to show, but there are other ways to do it. But yes, because you said that, because you put it in there, I just dragged that over into the share stream. So yep, it's happening now. Here we go. Distress Puff Paint logo just happened. So here we are. This is the logo we're talking about. You called me out. Here you go. There's the distressed logo that has the the puffy, and the drips and stringers. This is one of the kinds of distress that we can do. But the thing I want to show about this, actually, I will make a point with it immediately before we even go anywhere else with it. You don't have to use one stitch type, and just because something's distressed doesn't mean you can't have clean edges or use clean satin stitches. This is a puff logo. I still think this covers, because this is a distressed look. It's supposed to look like spray paint. The concept is we've got multiple layers in it. We have some flat layers, so the base layer is flat. We are allowing it to look pretty lumpy and bumpy. We're using regular straight stitches, though I have offset penetration points on these so that I don't have exactly the same penetration points going down and going back up. Those are manually set. You're going to find with distressing, a lot of your digitizing becomes manual because the edges of the shape aren't always what you want. There are some automated processes to make things more distressed, but in this particular piece, drawing those lines in yourself and individually moving points around so that our penetration points don't line up. We don't end up with, you don't want bean stitches in this. We want some offset. And in this particular case, if we zoom in real tight on this thing, you can see that the offsets are not lined up. Sometimes they line up, but most of the time we've got some things that are backtracked over. We have the ends, which are separated out. The two runs are separated, so we have some gapping and some thickness changes. And you can see that on some of the thicker parts, we've got satin stitch. I would still consider this a distressed logo. Why is it still distressed? The edges aren't super, super even. You can see that I've also done something that's interesting with the 3D foam. I have multiple kind of blobs of paint, and that's rendered by having a satin stitch that's down here. If you guys are listening to the podcast version, you're going to miss out on this one. I've got a satin stitch that's broken up into several pieces where we have one element of the satin stitch that's here, and then I run a second satin stitch over it so that I get a little shadow in here and it looks like multiple blobs of paint. The concept is in all of this stuff, it's very much like when I talk about doing handwork or work that looks handmade. The concept here is texture, and how much texture are we going to communicate? So whenever we're talking about this stuff, like this is really what it is. This is something, if something is distressed or destroyed, and we'll talk about the difference between those to a degree, what we're really saying is there's some texture involved. And most of the time when we're talking about it in the print world, it's an overlaid texture that's made to look like the piece is weathered. This should come into play for us. The concept is something is usually weathered. What does this mean? Paint on an old sign, a t-shirt in which the long-term use of the t-shirt, washing the t-shirt has worn off some of the plastisol ink, or it has cracked along folds. These kinds of distressing are what they use in print on purpose. We should think about this as a potential opportunity for us. As people doing embroidery, we can do distressing that looks like things that happen to embroidery. And this is something I want to talk about. We see things with breaks in the type. We can make breaks in the type that look like a piece of the letter has unraveled. Now, what I'm going to say about this is I have made a lot of cool distress stuff that customers have said no to. Why is that the problem? Why are we always asking this question, to render or not to render? Because very frequently, when we make distressed logos, when we make things that look destroyed or distressed, the problem is people may read that if they're not expecting it to be that kind of look, if they're not exactly thinking of that look exactly as it is in print, if we can't do very small amounts of distressing like you would see in print, they may see it as either poor embroidery or looking like the piece is actually broken, like something's wrong with it, like something has gone wrong, because that is largely what those distressed pieces look like, right? It looks like something has gone wrong. It looks like something has worn out. It looks like something is weathered, cracked, peeled, or otherwise messed up. It's aged. That's the concept. Depending on who you're working with, even when there's distressing in their logo, they may not like what's possible with embroidery. And especially when we work at the left chest hat front scale, especially on a short hat front, you may have a very little room to work with. And if you got satin stitches, there are only so many things we can do to an unbroken line of stitching, to the bar of stitching that goes across a satin column, that can make it look distressed. We have to be able to add texture to it, but things like breaks and edge quality, there are limits to what we can do without it looking like a poor execution of embroidery. That's part of the problem. Sometimes distressed designs just look like poor embroidery. So yeah, Mike says very much a compliment. I love that logo. All right, just for you, one more time, sir. I'll put it right back up. There it is, me picture in picture with all of its glory. There's the drippy paint logo as promised. This is, however, an example of one of those things you can do manually. Before we lay down the foam, we draw in these individual paint drips with straight stitches. We have some satin stitches, but what you're going to see here, before I ran this satin stitch, the satin stitch does have some edge quality reduction, you would call it, edge quality issues. What those edge quality issues are doing is essentially using a feathered or jagged edge. But these really long stringers that come out before it, in a run previous to running the satin stitch, I went and drew little zigzag outrunners that come from the straight stitch. So this is straight stitch that's drawn in before the piece. A lot of the problems people have is they're expecting very much like in a vector piece or working in Photoshop, that to distress a piece is to apply some filter. I'm going to lay something over the top of my embroidery work and it's going to make a distressed version of it. There are things we can do that make that happen. Certainly, jaggedness, roughness. We'll talk about this again. So, roughness, randomness of penetration points. We can loosen densities up. We'll talk about all of that. And now Wilcom has their hand stitch feature, does some things that are kind of like this that might look like distressing. And certainly in all software, in Stitch Artist, I've done some pieces where it really is more about the randomness of texture. But if you really want pieces like this, if you want pieces that have broken elements, and we're going to show you something like that later, what it often means is instead of drawing the entire piece, the entire logo, the entire letter that we're looking to distress, we're going to draw individual elements. If there's anything I can teach you about digitizing today, the one takeaway for everybody who wants the 30-second soundbite instead of the hour and a half that I usually do, the takeaway is this. Stop looking at lettering or logotypes or an individual letter or whatever it is. Stop looking at the shapes that are on screen in the art as an item and start looking at the lines, the areas that we're going to fill, and knowing that you're going to use multiple embroidery objects, multiple satins, multiple fills, multiple straight stitches, multiple embroidery objects that we draw to create any one given letter, one given portion of a logo. Just because it's one item in the vector doesn't mean it should be one item in the embroidery, and almost never. And when we're talking about things that are distressed like this, entirely, you are going to make any letter, any object that is distressed out of multiple pieces of embroidery, out of multiple objects that you draw on screen. Each one of these little straight stitch runs, then the satin stitch run on top of it, then individual columns into the satin stitch. Same thing, individual columns even in the foam run. These are individual pieces that come together to make the entire effect. This is 3 layers essentially of stitching that's put down. It doesn't run in one layer altogether, but there are 3 levels of stitching that are stacked on top of each other to make this. And this was not made by throwing a finished vector of this piece down and clicking a button and converting it. It was absolutely made by drawing or breaking up individual portions and assigning stitches to them. And even each one of these drips that is an individual object may be made up of 1, 2, or 3 objects as far as the lines I draw. Maybe there might be something down at the terminal. Some of these may have a drip at the end. These aren't big enough to have satin drips, but I've done this before where you run a straight stitch down to a satin drip, something that makes a thick drip at the end, and then you run it back. Or if we look at the end of this piece here, I've run 2 little straight stitch pieces to make this look like it's dripping. Then I've got this flat satin, and it tails into the 3D puff M that's done on the finished piece. Any given object that you see in the art can be and probably should be made of several embroidery objects. You will probably be drawing several objects to make that happen. That's across all softwares. That's across all platforms. There are certain kinds of distressing that only happen when we break up the objects and draw what we want and also leave out what we don't want. You want a hole in a letter, you want a break in the text, you're going to stop the column, not delete stuff out of it, not allow some filter to handle it. So step 1 and therefore everything else, if you're trying to make dimension or texture in a design beyond something that can be done by applying a setting. We're not talking feathering, we're not talking roughness, we're not even talking the hand stitch setting. If you want specific areas to be left out, doubled up, dripped, have a rough edge. Now, rough edge, we might be applying it, but if it has to be a specific portion of the design, it have to be a specific part of the letter that has a chunk missing out of it, you will be drawing that chunk. You will be drawing that letter to eliminate the pieces that you don't want. So right now, first things first, this isn't a filter. This isn't a setting. We will talk about filters and settings that help. But by and large, if something is really destroyed, it is the next level of distressed. The likelihood is you are going to be doing something to it that requires you to draw the shapes that you want and draw the shapes that you don't want, or leave out the things you don't want. Let me say hi to a couple more people who showed up and who are tuning in. So reciprocators, all of you guys who give back and give to the show, happy to have you in. Jeff Fuller of Fuller Embroidery Works, who joined me today on the half, by the way, with just about everybody from the Embroidery Nerd. So check that out if you didn't see the episode of the half on this YouTube channel. Jeff is in with Jeff and Adam saying hello. Hello, guys. I know you guys have done some awesome distressed work, because the other kind of cool distressed work you can do is with distressed materials. We'll talk about that in a minute. Adelina is in saying hello, and Yosta is in saying hi. Have to be back on a replay. Party is on. Have a great weekend. Yeah, have an awesome midsummer party out there in Sweden, and happy to have you whenever we do have you. Go get it out there and hit the party. Have fun. It's solstice time. All right, so with that, let's start talking about this a little bit more. Let's get into it. If you guys have questions or comments, by all means, I'd like to hear your questions and comments. But here's some of the stuff that I want to talk about. When we're talking about distressing, flat out, what are we talking about when we mean something is distressed? Like I said, it means that instead of being perfectly clean and clear, it has some sort of texture laid into it. And it looks like something has happened to it. It is rubbed down, roughed down, worn out. I usually make a difference between the terms distressed and destroyed. All this is really a matter of level, a matter of how much something is distressed. If something has a light texture to it or some roughness to it, I'm going to usually call it distressed. When there are pieces missing from the lettering, I call it destroyed. And I'm actually going to share with you kind of where that comes from to a degree. And I'm going to credit the folks who gave me, at least who gave me kind of the desire to use this terminology. And this is the folks over at Stalls. Now, if you don't know Stalls, been in business for like 90 years. I actually, it was really great this morning, got to host the two regular guys. We had Josh from Stalls on talking about stuff, but this is one of the ways I love doing distressed pieces. If you don't have to have anything except for a particular word and you can choose your fonts and it's not something where it has to be a particular logo, this is such a cool way of doing things. And in fact, I can go ahead and show you guys in my distressed photos here. We'll back off of our ever popular spray paint font, and we'll jump into this piece that I did for Keller Williams. And actually, this piece, we don't have to go searching through this. But this piece, I would almost call this destroyed. It's pretty heavily distressed. It's got pieces missing. This one is actually an accidental piece. This is why this one ended up as part of our sample kit, because it actually was missing a piece that it wasn't supposed to be. But this has big breaks in it. It's really rough. But we wanted to have this distressed vintage look, but we wanted it to be very much on the collegiate front, so that this thing very much looks like an old piece that's been washed a million times and the applique is starting to wear out. Now, it's extreme for that, and maybe it doesn't look like a naturally distressed item, but it's distressed. If we look at the stuff that we have from Stalls, I actually ordered this from Stalls, so this is not entirely my work. I did augment this piece in the end, but this is something you can order from Stalls. So even if you just have a heat press, they have these all pre-stitched in a stack, and you can heat press these too. Can you digitize and destroy your own? Absolutely you can, have done it. But you can also order it done already like this. The cool thing is, if you look at this piece, you can order this any word, any way. I'm just going to show you kind of where this comes from. You can add in your own text. I threw the Takeup on here because, hey, it's my show, might as well. But you can see this. This is the Takeup here, and this already has kind of a little bit of distress on it. So I've done mega extra large versions of this thing. And what I'm going to show you is, after you get through all your fonts, I've selected a block, in this case, Team US. These are the levels that they show on Stalls. And it's one of the reasons that I sometimes use this terminology, I think, or at least what's stuck in my head. We have distress, and you can see we've got some edge quality that's starting to be lost. We have some roughness around the edges. We have extreme distress. Extreme distress now has some pieces missing, a little bit of roughness that's around the edges, somewhat. We don't have a ton of pieces missing, but some pieces are ripped off and they are not present. That's a very extreme version of stress. We have breaks in our lettering. The U over here has a break in it. We have destroyed, and in this case, it is about the material. It's really shredded. It's absolutely torn up. So it's not just that there are pieces missing. There are threads and stringers coming off it. Believe me, you can see it once you see the real thing. And we have extreme destroy, which is essentially the pieces that are missing from the extreme distress, except for we've really roughed up the edges of the material. And this is usually put together. I used to order it in the twill. You can also order it in the felt. I love the twill because we also get strings. We get unraveling, and those extra strings kind of really add more textural variation. And as somebody washes the garment, they're going to get the extra strings and the roughness on it. I actually like that. When we're talking about trying to make a distressed destroyed piece, I think that's interesting. So sometimes when you hear me referring to these different versions of distressed and destroyed, that's what I'm talking about. It's not necessarily universal. Not everybody's going to say the same stuff. But for me, if I'm talking about a piece that's distressed, we've got some texture on it. Something is rough about it. Maybe we've added some shading to it. So we might have used some contrasting color and shaded some things in so things look rough or torn up a little bit. We have that going on with a distressed piece. When we're talking about a destroyed piece, I'm saying that we have pieces missing, that I'm digitizing holes in things, that I'm leaving off pieces of letters, that it is legitimately looking pretty rough. Pieces are looking like they're missing. So distress stuff in general for me is just going to be textured. We're going to be seeing a little bit of texture. We've got some edge quality kind of issues. We're having some roughness in the edges. Maybe we've got some drips, trailers, and strings. Depends on how the art is set up. That's the kind of stuff that we're looking for. So we're feathering. We're working on edge quality. We have stuff like that. But if you're seeing something that's destroyed, I'm talking about pieces are missing. I'm talking about breaks in the type. Now they use it a little differently. They're using it for the edge quality of the actual materials. For me, I'm talking about what we would have to do for our digitizing to change that piece. Do we want it distressed or destroyed? Most of the time, it's laid out by the art, and I'm going to show you some art and talk about that. But it's certainly something that people do differently. I'm going to go ahead and grab a comment here because I think we're talking about this stuff right now. Jeff says the Chino twill is awesome. A little thicker weight, has a great feel to it. I wish they had a poly version. Yeah, the Chino twill is really fantastic if you get to use it for anything. What I will say is it is harder than you would think to cut things in a way that you can tear them away easily and they still leave that rough texture. Cutting your own can be a little harder when you're doing applique materials like that. I know that there are people who do things like leaving tabs or partially cutting it, having strings left over intentionally, even if they're doing like laser cuts. So when they tear away the excess pieces, they intentionally make that roughness, but it's something that can be difficult to do. At some point, I'll try and bring somebody on who's done some of this work. I actually have somebody who I may be bringing on at some point to have an interview about that stuff. But it's pretty interesting to do. And yeah, Mike, I don't believe that they sell the Chino twill by the yard. This is something you'd be doing on your own if you're going to do it with the Chino twill. I will say that if you like the Stalls product and you're doing stuff with a standard varsity type or script type like that, anything that's in their standard types, I will vouch for the fact that I really like the quality of the Stalls product. It's not for everybody to do a pre-made piece like that, but if you have somebody who just says, I want destroyed, distressed varsity appliques, those are super cool. If they're into that kind of look, I would at least give it a look because it does save you a lot of design and decoration machine time. I mean, you can save a lot of time on it. May not be for you, but it's something I just wanted to bring up, mostly because I wanted to make kind of a difference. When I make the difference between distressed and destroyed, I usually mean something that's lightly distressed that has some edge quality or some show through versus something where there are pieces missing on purpose. That's really what I mean when I say that. Since I do tend to use those terms a fair amount, that's what I'm talking about. But you can go about this in different ways, and certainly we'll talk about technical ways that we can go about it. Often enough, though, it's the art that's giving us these hints, and we have to make some decisions. And I'm actually going to talk about some of the art that I've dealt with and discussions that I've had about this. And certainly, when I posted this show, I had to make some jokes about it, right? Certainly, there are some things that we all talk about as far as distressing that's annoying to us. And the first one for me, the one that caused me all the problems, and pardon me, I've got like downloads showing on this thing. This is what constantly caused issues for me. The font Papyrus. This is the first one that I remember being really annoying. In my lifetime, I have destroyed so many pieces of Papyrus font art and had to work on these things and explain to people. They would bring this in for the longest time, if anything was whatsoever set in a Middle Eastern genre. If somebody wanted something to look like it was a desert sort of logo or theme, everything was typeset in Papyrus. And early on in my career, it was just drove me nuts for a few reasons. For one, as you can see, our lowercase e here has a really, really small counter in it. It is teeny tiny, doesn't sew very well at small sizes unless you open it up. But the second thing you can see in this lowercase a here, it has little pieces and chunks missing out of it. And depending on who you're working with or what they're using this logo for, or what kind of logotype they're using with this, they may think that that roughness is something they want. And you can imagine that if I'm going down to left chest size and have a decently long word, and I've got, 5 millimeter lowercase that's going on or less, seeing these little chunks, any variation in my materials, any variation in the texture of the garment itself, heck, small variations in where the needle is landing can either accentuate or remove texture of this level. So this is where we're talking about edge quality issues, right? So edge quality issues were the very first thing that I ever dealt with. And this is one of those times where I'm going to say flat out, for me, for my work, Largely when I do this level of distressing, when I take little chunks out of something, especially when you're talking about a piece, I will say this though: if people are absolutely into it, if they're absolutely sold on this, they will be concerned that the little piece that's missing isn't missing in the right spot. You see this piece missing on the upper stroke of the A. I have had somebody get unhappy when they don't have the little chunk missing at the right spot. The truth of the matter, though, is over the course of my entire career, over decades of making stuff and dealing with fonts like this, on the balance, nobody likes the end result. And we end up rendering these things largely with standard, flat edged, normal satin stitches. I'm not going to tell you it'll never happen to you. And especially you do a big piece, we start using this same font across the shoulders of a letter jacket, and somebody, for some reason, I'm going to guess meme worthy trollery, decides they want papyrus on the back of their jacket from shoulder to shoulder. And then we can start talking about whether or not you want to leave out pieces and parts and whether or not you want to add texture. Otherwise, this font specifically, if you go and look, you can find smooth versions of this font rendered out even in vector, even in OpenType, because so many people hate the distress that's on this that people have drawn out and created smooth versions, smooth vector, smooth OpenType versions of the Papyrus font. For my money, in embroidery, no matter how many times I render something like this, it usually reads as poor embroidery, not as distressing, not as old school, not as ancient, not as antique. It reads like we have bad edge quality. So when something is just like this, it is fairly minor distressing. Yes, there are some pretty big chunks out of it, but it's just along the edges. Most of the time when I've done a piece like this, people hate it. They don't really want it. And honestly, the natural variation that happens to us with regular embroidery is often enough, especially on any textured material, that people are going to read it as a little bit rough anyway. You could decide that that was smooth or rough in your mind and it wouldn't change much about it. So pieces like Papyrus, I feel like that is just not worth, most of the time, not worth your time trying to render out these little edges, especially not drawing a satin stitch and specifically having to add 3, 4 more points every time there's a little chunk on this thing to take out a specific chunk of the edge of the letter. Have I done it? Yes, under duress. Most of the time, especially we're talking about left chest size, hat size logos and logotypes, most of the time it doesn't really read as a thing you were trying to do. It reads as a problem you're having with the font. One of the best things you can do with any of this stuff is to have some style samples. Have pieces stitched out to show someone what you mean. Our customers are not embroidery experts. Our customers are likely not going to understand what we mean when we discuss this with them. They're going to look at their logo and say, nope, but that's the font I use. What they mean are the shapes. They want the A to look like this. They want this kind of high E that has the stem up toward the top instead of dead center. They want the shapes that are involved. They want the strokes to be there. They may not really mean, I want every little chunk and chip out of the edge of this thing exactly where it is. Ask a customer before you do it. Don't be me. Don't do extra work when you don't need to. Ask a customer before you do it. And yeah, I fully agree. We've got a couple comments on that for sure. Justin says, curse that font for embroidery. 100%. You've been around the industry about as long as I have. So you, I'm sure, have been cursed. You've dealt with the Pharaoh's curse that is Papyrus yourself. And yes, at the end of the day, you hate it. I hate it too. By the way, if you're like me and have done a lot of vinyl cutting as well, curse that font for vinyl cutting for the same reasons. It just looks bad sometimes. Can you make it work better for cutting? Yes. Small lettering with little cuts. Have fun weeding that unless your cutter is tuned up right the way it should be. And Ramona says, hate that font. Yep, me too. I'm actually going to share one that I hate even more. And this is funny because we've got a couple comments on this. I've shown this article before because I love it so much. Bleeding Cowboys. Bleeding Cowboys. This is one that is so bad. I belong to a Facebook group called Bleeding Cowboys Life that all they do is post when they find an example of bleeding cowboys being used in the wild because it is so heinous. But what we're going to see about this one is it actually has more distressing and different kinds of distressing than you see in Papyrus. If we're looking in Bleeding Cowboys, and by the way, yeah, that quote, we could almost say Bleeding Cowboys is to font, says Nickelback is to rock and roll. Hey, I'm sorry for anybody who's a dyed in the wool Nickelback fan. Yeah, can't help it. But Bleeding Cowboys, the funny thing about this specific type here, when you go to this article and where I got this from, is an article that says Bleeding Cowboys font designer tired of his own creation now that he runs a graphic design business. Yeah, no doubt. This font does have some other kinds of distressing. We're seeing some of those drips. What did I talk about before? Drips and stringers. This one most definitely has all of that. So what do we have again? We've got drips, trailers, and strings. That's when we have all of these little kind of shiny trailers, drips, drops, and strings coming away from it. Certainly, it has all these weird added strokes and curls, but you're also going to see that we've got some extreme, I would almost call it destroyed pieces. The strokes that are up here in the tops of the L's especially show you where we have missing pieces, strokes that are almost entirely gone. The problem is we all know stitches go all the way across that column unless we break them up or make short stitches. This is something that you can't render out with textures. You're going to have to render that out by drawing elements out of a shape or having multiple pieces to make up that L. This is not a font or a typeface that's going to be easily made through just distressing existing pieces. Here's hoping nobody's actually asking you to make anything with Bleeding Cowboys. But once again, I'm going to tell you that a lot of the time, if you make a font that has all of this, especially if you go light text on dark, and the folks who like Bleeding Cowboys are definitely going to ask for black shirts. If you go light on dark, you're going to see a very stitchy presentation, and a lot of people don't like it. Most of the people I see rendering this out, they may do some drips, drops, and edge quality issues, but up here in the top of these L's where we have absolute breaks in the pieces that are just over and over lined breaks, they're either just going to lower some densities. I'm going to show you some ways you can do that it works, or they're going to go ahead and render it as a full satin stitch so that it's legible. Because remember, when we're dealing with logo types, these are things that are intended to be read. If we're talking about somebody's business and what they're trying to get out of this, which is promoting the business, they want the thing to be read. So yeah, drips, trailers, and strings you can add pretty easily, but some of the breaks in the type, that's where it can get dicey. Like I said, we're going to show you something because I'm actually going to show you what I did as an addition to that stalls stuff that I did for Keller Williams. The word realty underneath it is also destroyed or distressed, and I did that in software. I'm going to show you how I did that in software with settings. Rather than drawing a lot of extra pieces, I actually did use settings to get some interesting broken looks to the type that are similar to this. So we are going to talk a little bit about that as we go forward. But I just want to point out the differences in what we have going on. Could you handle some of the drips and stringers? Absolutely. And I'll bring up, much as I'm against it, I'll bring up Bleeding Cowboys again and say, all right, all the little drips and stringers, we could render those out by drawing those with straight stitch before the main body of the letter runs. Like I said, we're not just going to type this out. We're going to draw those in before the main body of the letter runs and then run the rest of the letter on top of it with standard satin stitches. Some of the breaks we could use some jagged edge on it. It'll be a little more random, but as long as somebody's not too concerned about the randomness, we could use jagged edge settings on our satins, not a problem. So feathering or jagged edges, depending on the software you're in. And some of the other breaks, we might just leave off pieces. The end of this K that is missing, we have a serif that's almost gone. I'm going to say that if it is almost gone to the point that we all we have is a few little dots left on the end of the serif on this K in rock and roll, the likelihood is I'm just going to leave a portion of that serif off. I'm just not going to render the entire thing. But some of the other stuff like internal voids, we have dots inside of that top of that R. The likelihood is I'm probably not going to render that because it is just too small. And the L's, maybe some density changes. I'm going to show you how we can use either accordion spacing or some other density tricks to make that work, either by breaking that up into two satin columns or by using specific accordions that allow for some portion of that to be loose. But it's something that we can probably handle. What I'm going to say is, though, if the customer's need is for legibility, this may be a bad thing to do. The erosion at small sizes may, and it may not even read. If we think about the distance from which we view the piece, our eye is going to fill in more than we take out. So distress, to render or not to render, that being our question yet again, to render distressing or not to render distressing, I think is largely a function of a few things. Number one, the size of the image we're rendering, the size of the finished decoration. Very, very small decorations, it doesn't make a ton of sense to try and render a bunch of distress into it because whether we're drawing texture on top of a piece, and I'll show you a little bit about that, or removing elements, your eye literally is going to fill it in at distances. So if it's a small enough piece at distance viewed from the 3 to 4 feet that is the standard kind of handshake distance that you are away from a person when we're talking about apparel, the likelihood is rendering out little bitty pieces of detail like that and the kind of destroyed columns that we're seeing is really not going to be worth the time spent. Certainly, there are customers who love this stuff, and in order to please them and make them happy with their logo, you might do the work. But if we talk about how visible it is, especially when some of those textures are really difficult to render and might incur extra trims, extra cost, extra stitch count, extra time on the machine, extra time in finishing, it's a good idea to show a customer and say, do you really see this, or do you feel like the shape of the letters? Because you can make Bleeding Cowboys with the regular letters and those long swooshes and not render the portions that are destroyed. You could add the drips without taking out the destroyed, distressed pieces out of it, and still have something that reads, that matches the original logo somebody's using if they are just desperate for that font, and still have something that looks like their piece. So for me, those three things, like I said, it is the size of the finished design, the kind of distressing. If it's just some edge roughness, we can handle that pretty simply, and it's a quick thing to do. If it is full on destruction and it's actually something where we can see a very large broken area and it makes sense, we can remove pieces out of a letter, we can remove pieces out of a logo, then that makes sense. If it is a texture that we can add fairly simply, either through custom texture breaks in fills, custom textures we add to our satins, or through using randomness in a fill texture, then those are simple to do. And lastly, so the size of the design, the type of the destruction, and certainly the last question always is it really important to the customer? Is it super important to the customer to the point that they will not accept the piece without an attempt at it? Then I might actually go for it, even if it's not really advisable. But most of the time for me, unless the design is large enough and it doesn't and the type of distressing doesn't interfere with the technical nature of the embroidery and the legibility, what it's being used for, when they're large enough, when they make sense, when the type of distressing can be rendered without completely breaking the embroidery process, I'm all for it. But the thing I will often say is, the question isn't really to render it or not to render it. It's, do we follow the art exactly, or do we find something similar that gives you the feeling of the distressing or the destroying that can make the customer happy? Because sometimes we can do things similar that make the customer happy either way. So that's one of those things, right? And that's, like I said, I don't love those fonts, but hey, that's how it is. And a couple more comments. Mike says, Papyrus, curse that font for everything. It and Comic Sans can go away. Hey, similar feeling here. I like to have options instead of that. Why do they do that to us? Says Ramona. Yep. Justin said, just did a design with that font used. I'm sorry. Your card is in the mail for condolences. So yeah, those fonts are not the best. But like I said, this is nothing that we're doing that's new. Take yourself over to defont.com and look up the fancy eroded page, and you'll see all these different types. Some of these are a little more interesting. Up here, you'll see ones that look like they're rendered as a process print. They have dots in them. This kind of thing we can use by having meshes of light fills and varying our densities and adding some detail in by drawing in layers, by drawing in some satins, by drawing in some straight stitches. You have things that have folds, creases, these kinds of small details, like here in the word plane crash, much harder to achieve. Same thing with urban jungle here, which part of the distressing is a city scene on the bottom of it. Trying to cut out pieces that don't match with the angle of our satin stitch and or leave small stringy details can be hard. But a lot of this stuff has some very similar stuff going on. We've got edge quality issues, we've got show through issues, we have these scrapes, we have missing pieces, and a lot of them don't make a ton of sense for us. If you have something like this is Krakvetica, great name, I'm sure, where it has cracks in it. You may find that instead of trying to render gaps in the piece, you might actually draw detail on top. But it's really hard to make this stuff look good at small sizes, and most of the time, um, just having kind of variation in the font shape and position that is similar to, you can see the kind of baseline and top line on these are a little rough, a little weird. That might be enough. But then you have things that are brush stroked. And in this case, things that have brush strokes, often we're doing very much like I showed you earlier with that foam piece, where we will draw with our straight stitches and have little brushed edges coming outside of our satin stitch letters. But we may not then continue on with multiple pieces of satin stitch if it's too small, or we may not decide to continue rendering that extra brush texture throughout the piece. And this has been going on forever. So this is nothing new. I'm not showing you to try and make you get unhappy, because this stuff, I mean, I look at this font Ghost Factory down here and I want to throw my hands up and say, never mind. Some of this is a great way to do printing. Same thing with this letterpress font up here. When we have internal voids like this, it becomes a question of, do I draw the outside edge and then the rest of the font? You can do pieces like that, but at small sizes, they almost always just look like something's missing from the stitching. It doesn't really look as good as you might want it to. Larger sizes, we can start working on things with texture. Smaller sizes, it just doesn't make the sense. I mean, really, the best thing we can do is say embroidery is a different animal from print and show them what embroidery makes sense with. But I'm going to show you some other stuff too. But let's go ahead and get a couple more comments as well. Yeah, it's just one of those things we have to talk about. So Mike says this distress font thing is actually part of a bigger problem. Designers not taking into account all the potential destinations said design. Some of this looks fine in print on the web or as a screen print, but awful in other mediums. Stop making graphics and calling them logos. Yeah, the logo should be, and I don't know, I'm old school. I tend to think of a logo as something that I can recognize from the outline. In black and white, I want to be able to recognize it from the outline. If we're just adding a bunch of textures to it, it's very much, honestly, it's very much like gradients and metallics. A gradient being a part of your logo, I have a hard time with. A metallic, I have a hard time. Metallic textures, I can't tell you how many times I've wasted my time trying to render chrome and embroidery, where I'm doing the reflections of the sky and the ground and everything in the piece to find out that the person just wanted shiny, and I could have just used metallic thread. That's not really a logo thing. That's a treatment thing. That's an eventual execution thing. It's not something that you really draw in the logo, and I find this kind of distressing as well to be hard to tolerate sometimes with that. There are reasons to do it that make sense, but I prefer to have an embroidered version that doesn't have that. But yeah, like Mike says, it's not that we can't do cool things, but it requires a lot of interpretation. And like I said, if we're dealing with stuff like this piece here, this Ghost Factory text that's at the bottom, um, there are things that just don't make as much sense in embroidery. And if you were trying to read this piece on someone's shirt, you would probably rather see something that wasn't choppy and chunky. But let's talk about some actual real world examples. Let's show you some things that I did that I've actually worked on. I mean, like I said, if you want to learn more about this stuff, just go look up adding grunge or distressing to vector. I'm just going to show you like one of the pieces I saw earlier. You guys know I love the designer Von Glitchka. He does a lot of this stuff. When you're doing vector art, it can look ultra clean. And so they like to do things like this where you add grunge to the logo. And just to show you what that looks like, and I'm not going to be playing the sound and everything else, but if you see this piece that he's working on, what he's often doing is layering over something that looks like this. It's a texture, and texture not in the way that we talk about it, actual three-dimensional texture, but they will work on something like this, a two-dimensional graphic or vector that they then lay on top of something clean, and they get this distressed look. If you want to learn more about it, go check out that kind of stuff. Check out the videos. Great for print. Not always great for everything else that we do. And like I said, it's not something that we really want to work with embroidery. And I think the problem is people think that this is the kind of process. And honestly, we've got this other stuff going on. Let me see if I can give you guys one more look. This is not the kind of process we're going to be able to do to a finished embroidery font or file and make that work. So it's something that doesn't make a lot of sense for us, but it is something that we might want to look at as far as how it's done. Then you can understand kind of where they're coming from as far as how these things are put together. But with that, let's talk about some actual pieces that I've done, and we'll discuss how I put them together. I showed you the Keller Williams piece, and we'll get back to it, but this is one that I wanted to bring up. One that I actually had issues with where we did multiple versions called New Mexico True. And this is New Mexico's tourism department does the New Mexico True piece. And actually, this one has had very, very many renderings. I've seen a ton of them, multicolor renderings, single color renderings. And I'm going to say right now, some of them, the breaks, like you see the break in this E, which is repeated, it is from a font, very obviously, because that break in the E is in the same in two places. The crack in the N can be more exaggerated than this. We've got breaks and erosion in the C. And you can also see that they've used a void to describe a small Zia symbol in the eye. Now you can imagine this as a left chest design with satin stitch text. And I've got some old files that I'm going to show you. So these are actually not, usually I'm in Stitch Artist. Some of these are going to be in Wilcom. I'm going to show you different stuff that I've worked on, but this one is in Wilcom because it's an old file I've used before. But yeah, the New Mexico True text is something I've absolutely worked on before. And yes, I've got some of the other stuff I brought up, but here's the original stuff, right? So the original New Mexico True logo that we were presented with, and I brought in this one that's not quite as distressed. You can see that we had the chunks that are missing out of the E. We've got this crack in the N. We have these chunks missing here. This is actually a little less distressed than the original art that I brought in when I first worked on this piece. but there are some distressed pieces there, and you can see that they're hard to visualize. But they were very clear that they wanted one layer of embroidery. They did not want to have a second color on it. They didn't want to run straight stitches on top of it. And the argument was, how do we get this rendered out? So I am just going to show you kind of what I originally did, and the original piece was done like this. And what you can see here, if we're looking at it, this is multiple pieces. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm just the one who told you don't do this. Why did I tell you not to do this? Because the truth of the matter is, at the end of the day, we finally went with a non-distressed version of this years down the road. When they first made this logo, they were so keen on the concept of this eroded text that they bought into it and they would not take a piece that didn't have that eroded text, or at least they wouldn't from our shop. They desperately wanted to see all of this erosion in the text. They wanted all these different pieces rendered out. So we worked on it. And so, in order to make it work, what are the few things that we did? Well, if we have a gap here, what you can already see is I've exaggerated the gap to make it wider. We all know that a certain small gap is not going to work. If it gets too small, it'll just close up, and that's not enough texture for them. They want to see what I always say, some daylight through it. They want to see a reveal of the background texture of the material behind it. And so we can see that I exaggerated that gap. Also, we had some areas that were loose here. How am I getting this looseness? I'm actually going to show you this again on the Realty logo. Depending on what part of the piece it is, I will actually use accordion fills. So spacing in a fill that allows me to have less density in one area than another. But if we look at the rest of these pieces, what do we have here? That's an object. That's an object. So one, two, three, four objects make up the stroke that's here. Part of that is for pathing purposes, and part of it is so that I can have different settings on each of these objects, and so that I can overlap pieces and have intentional chunks drawn out of it. Same thing over here in the E. What are we going to see here? We have texture that's inside of the break. I've got some straight stitch elements that are put in here. So these are running stitch elements that show you this broken texture and then have different directions on them. And they connect together multiple satin stitch objects in the break. Did we run this? Yeah, we ran these. They worked out. The eventual look was okay. I didn't love it. Wasn't my favorite thing I've ever done. Certainly, you'll also see if there were chunks missing or extra little pieces on the side. I actually drew those in. So we didn't just use feathering. I drew in the chunks that were missing. Definitely copy and paste was involved. Copied and pasted these elements because the E's were the same, the C's were the same. But you can see I'm drawing in. These actual chunks are drawn out. Those are control points rendering out the pieces that are broken up. I'm not applying a setting. However, you will see that in this piece, I used a straight stitch rendering of the Zia. Originally, just in the areas that were on top of the text, it was not a good fit. Didn't work out very well, didn't like it. I eventually went with, we fought with it over not having the Zia as a portion because these are really, really, really fine lines. Um, or we eventually went with a Zia that was unbroken, it was entirely stitched in. And all of these things changed back and forth because the rendering was always hard to get just right. And we have a fairly small piece here. Like I said, this is not a super tiny piece, but we're dealing with a less than 4-inch piece. And honestly, this was the largest size it was ever rendered at. And we went smaller and smaller as the time went on. And as we went smaller and smaller, you can see even the other text that they chose in here, the true text that's in here, once again, is a distressed text. It is less distressed than the other one. It doesn't have the destruction portions in it, but it does have roughness, peaks, and elements that are sticking off the edges. What did we do for that? Once again, we largely drew those in, and we tried to have some variation in the densities, and that was done either with filling or by drawing lines in such a way that it forced some density changes. So what are we doing here? We are absolutely drawing multiple elements per piece. That's something to remember. Like I said, if I could teach you anything about this, is if you want drips, chunks, missing pieces, or, and this is something else I've done, you want to do the fully destroyed look and you want it to look like a piece of actual embroidery that's falling apart, I have drawn in my underlay separately so that it literally looks like a piece is missing, but the underlay didn't come out. So I've done this on purpose. This one is more about the distressing. We have some different directions going on, but one of the other things I've done on some bigger pieces is to draw in underlay that I want to still remain after I'm done, but still have multiple chunks of the satin involved, and leave the underlay manually drawn for the whole letter, leave it in place and visible so it looks like there's still underlay there, and part of this is actually torn out, has unraveled over time. But like I said, is this the best way to handle this logo? I'm going to say no. I'm going to say no. This is what we ended up with on a couple of the design pieces. So it has those kind of chunks missing. It has pieces missing out of the C. That's what we went with for a while. That was the original rendering when the tourism department first started. And you can kind of see on this piece how we have kind of this chunky, kind of eroded version of the E that kind of shows a little bit of daylight. But eventually, what did they go with? This is the end result. After all of that work, when we started getting smaller and smaller, this logo is once again just a little under that same size. So we're under 4 inches. As we get smaller and smaller, what we end up doing, we fully rendered the Zia on top so that if you saw it, it would be visible that there's still more of the Zia. We did use the color of the background material for the Zia. And the final piece, though we do have some over and under, some play with which parts are over and under with the two colors, everything is smooth. Everything is rendered smooth. There is no more distress on it. And in the smaller sizes, especially, it just makes more sense. Is this the only way you're ever going to render something like this? Absolutely not. Is it the way this one eventually turned out? Absolutely, yes, it did. There's, like I said, there are multiple ways we can go about it. So this is when we have a destroyed logo with those chunks of text missing, things like that. So like I said, it's not always going to be the case. Some of the other things that can be destroyed, we can end up with some texture quality. We talked about the drips and drabs and all of that stuff that goes around. But you may also have things like just random textures, and we'll have show through. And for show through, when we have some roughness where it looks like something's worn or showing some of the texture through, you may just do things like reduce or randomize your density. So what I'm going to show you is a couple different things. First, I'm going to show you a satin stitch version of that and how it ended up, and then I will show you a version in fill stitch that we did to try and render something, and I'll show you a couple different versions of how that turned out and what the customer actually went with. First thing is, we'll go ahead and grab you the distressed realty logo. And you guys saw earlier when I was looking at that original set of pieces, we talked about this Keller Williams piece. I'm going to bring that up so you can see it again. This is the original Keller Williams piece. It was done in that Stahl's destroyed or heavily distressed piece. I think this one actually is destroyed because it's got all the strings and what have you coming off of it. But in this piece, when we first ran it, we ran the word realty underneath it. That is not part of what Stahl set up for us. That is something that goes with their original logo, and it's in a font that is one of their fonts. When we did the original render of it, I ran it all super clean, super normal, and it was very visible, and it was obvious that that text looked very clean. And when we ran the text really clean underneath the logo while we were doing the applique process part of it, it just stuck out like a sore thumb. It didn't look the way we wanted to. So we wanted something that was going to be a little rougher, a little more jagged, and have some gaps in it. And so we decided to render a much rougher version of it. So let's go ahead and back up to what we ended up working with on this piece. And I'll just show you what it is. We ended up working on a piece that we did this to. This is the realty text, and I have it broken apart so you can see it. We eventually did create a version of the text, but what I'm going to show you is in this particular case, we didn't actually end up rendering out all the different shapes. You're going to see that I have a standard logo. If you see the lines that are inside of this piece, I did not draw all the edges. The lines are clean. We're using a fairly standard font to make this happen. This is not something that I've rendered out in extreme detail the way that I did that other piece. So how did I achieve the look that I'm getting here? We've got a couple pieces where we have chunks. You'll see that some of these are done that way. I went ahead and did some destruction. So here on the E, we do have some pieces where I'm drawing in the chunks, the pieces that are cut out of the spine of the E. There are some of them done that way, but the rest of the strokes, you can see the rest of the strokes don't have it. So every once in a while, I'm dragging in a control point, but otherwise, the most of the time, these pieces are just done with nice clean lines. So we have clean lines for most of it. Where we occasionally have an extreme destroyed piece, I'm grabbing a couple of control points and I'm dragging something inside of the line so that I have something broken that gives you that kind of extra destroyed look. So instead of completely drawing all these different shapes, I'm just using a couple of hints. And on this piece over here, if we look at the R, and I've broken it down into several individual chunks, on the R, we have almost none of that. We don't really have a lot of drawing that's been done to make this happen, but we have a really randomized look, right? So what are we doing to get this incredibly randomized look? I've separated out this backstroke so you can see it. And if we're looking at kind of the properties on this piece, what do we have that's making the difference? We have a couple different things going on with it. We have jaggedness. So if you're in Stitch Artist, we call it feathering. And I've got some other pieces I can show you with that later, but we've got feathering and we have roughness here. We have jaggedness on this one with both sides. So we're using a jagged edge. If you're in Stitch Artist, you would call it feathering. And we are using here a fill called accordion fill. And in that case, that is gradient fills. In this case, we have a profile that goes denser and less dense. You can also do it by breaking up the column into multiple separate columns and having one that goes less dense, one that goes more dense, or breaking up into several pieces and using different densities per portion of that piece. In the end, what we end up with is some areas that are more dense, some that are less, and we've also made the edge jagged, so we have some jaggedness on the edge, and it's more or less jagged. And because we have some extra density in some areas and in other or than in others, it looks more extreme in the areas of less density. So one of the cool things we can do, make a couple of different breaks in the piece, add accordion fill to it, so change your spacing on your fill, or do a couple of different pieces, break this up into three pieces, change the densities between the three pieces of that back column, and then add jaggedness to one or both sides. And we can end up with a piece that looks rough, that looks rendered, and it looks a little bit like it's coming apart, like it's starting to unravel. It's not perfect, but when we're just looking to set apart that texture a little bit, sometimes we can use on standard fonts a little bit of this kind of, I would call it automated. We can also use hand stitch settings if your software has hand stitch settings, and we can do something similar. I'll show you one more piece that's over here as well, and we'll actually show the final version of it. This is another piece that was interesting. A company called Death Roll, and what they originally brought us, and I believe I can show you the art on this. We'll try and hide all the rest of the stuff, but let me grab the art that's underneath it if I can grab it. Let me grab it out of the object list. But we had the original art in this piece. If I can unlock that stuff, let's unlock everything, grab the art, and we'll move that art out of the way so you can see it. But so here's our original art on this piece, and it is kind of silhouette style. And what we have are these gators in a silhouette style, but they have a lot of drips. They have a lot of roughness in them. You can see that there's some texture. To me, this looks very much like an auto traced piece. So some of the texture is not awesome, but we do have some roughness, some texture, and some kind of like strings and globs and pieces coming off of it. So when we originally came to them with this, they were big on the roughness. A death roll, you know, it's like an alligator rolling under the water when they're attacking something. That's what a death roll is. This was the concept they brought to us and what they were trying to achieve. But when we're talking about caps, this is not a lot of space for that texture to live. Really, it's not a tremendous amount of space for that texture to exist. So the first thing we did, we kind of looked at and said, all right, is this important to you? Do you want it? Yes, they wanted some of that texture. They definitely wanted to look like it's splashing out of the water. And they wanted some of these little kind of random strings coming off of it, right? So the first version we did was this. And you can see I said, all right, are you really set on having that texture be dark and heavily contrasted? They said yes. And I originally went with just straight stitch detail. And because I am someone who does not want to do a bunch of crazy trims, I actually used small stitches in between, as you can see, at size. Not as, you know, certainly not as random as we have up here, but I went ahead and connected them all because I thought, honestly, at size on a hat front, you're really not going to see it. The connectors are not going to make a big difference, and it just looks nice and rough. And you can still see we've got these strings, which once again, if you want to look at these different strings, that is manual straight stitch. And some of the dots are done with little bitty stars. You want little round drips that are teeny tiny. Little stars are the way to go. Draw little stars and they pull down into dots. So dots and drips, little stars in your straight stitch or manual stitch can absolutely make dots and drips. But the thing is, those looked pretty good. We weren't very unhappy with those. We did some randomness on these. We did digitize these multiple passes, not one pass there and then copy it in one pass back. You digitize the out and the in so we can offset our penetration points. As you can see, they are not the same going out as they are coming back in. And we have little dots for the pieces. But what I'm going to tell you is this texture in here, no matter how we tried to show it to them, they just thought, you know what, too much contrast. They didn't love it. The way that texture ran, it looked a little bit too much like cracking to them. I understand that. Even in different colors where it wasn't quite as contrasty, they decided this was not the look they wanted, right? They didn't like that look. And we ended up taking that texture off. And instead, we ran with some different textures and we showed them a couple different ones. First was like a split or length limited satin texture over here. We did on the left hand side with some randomness. And over on the right hand side, we actually had a fill style randomized texture. And what I'm going to tell you is this, with slightly less density, with not a lot of underlay underneath it, allowed for just enough of the dark garment to show through that they liked this instead. So what did we do here? We lowered our density somewhat. We used a randomized texture on the fill patterns, and we allowed the massive contrast between this bone white and the background to show through, and this became an acceptable version. So let's go back to our gallery, and yes, we got our Keller Williams here, but we're going to go ahead and show you the actual piece. I believe we've got this up here for you to see. Oh, and it didn't come through. I had some issues with that earlier. We can actually show you a little bit on the banner that we did for the brand. Here, we'll pull this up. You can see over here on the over right hand side, that's the texture. Unfortunately, I had some issues with the gallery earlier opening up, but over on the right hand side, you can see that there's texture. It's just enough, especially when we take into account that we loosened up the density and allowed some of the show through. Over here on the right hand side of the image, you'll see the final texture of the piece has just enough roughness, just enough show through that they considered that to be the same kind of distress, or at least that the distress was useful enough and recognizable enough to them that they enjoyed it. That was something that they thought was worth working on. So honestly, I think that's something that you can do. You use textures instead that make sense for you. And sometimes it means that you don't get to have exactly the kind of textures you're looking for, but invariably a little bit of show through something like that is going to serve you better long term than working out some sort of texture on top. So long term, the concept was better to allow some show through than to go through the point of drawing it all on the top. Now sometimes that can be something worthwhile to do. Drawing texture on top can be useful. Small straight stitch texture, like I said, the dots and the drips and the drabs are certainly worthwhile and something that I would certainly recommend you do some manual texture work on. But you're going to find that some customers are just not as clear about what they want with that, and they may not be into the drawn on texture. Luckily, I actually do have the photo here in better quality. I'm going to pop that up for you. Sorry about that. I had that issue with the photo. Tried to grab it on the fly. So let's go ahead and pop this back up. And if we throw this up here, now you can see a little bit closer. It is a very light texture. It's not a lot. You can also see the little drips and drabs. You see those little stars that looked very much like stars. Now they're just little blobs. Absolutely. Little stars turn into little round blobs when you digitize those as they pull in tight. Is this the most amazing rendering in the world? No. I'm going to say I don't think their art was the most amazing in the world as far as trying to give me that detail. Um, do I like the other version better? Personally, I like the version that they considered crackled better than this version. But in the end, they liked this texture, and it is one other way to handle it. Lighten up your densities, allow for there to be a little more show through, and use randomization, use fill textures that are random to make that happen. So, I mean, I think there are other ways we could go about this. Certainly, this is a worthwhile one, and I think that it's something that we can use to our advantage when we're trying to get those textures to show. Certainly, there are other things we can do to have distress textures work out for us. Roughness is one of those things, as using randomness and feathering, using whip stitch. These are things that I talked about with hand embroidery type work. If you added this whip stitch or multiple satin count and you put that in with changes in spacing, changes in density, with accordion fills, you can put things together to get a tremendous amount of randomness and roughness, even if we're not changing the font. The problem is, even if we're not doing that drawing, we get some of that roughness, but you don't get the things like I showed before with the drips. You don't get the drips and drabs. You don't get the chunks that are cut out of portions of the letters. That kind of stuff only happens when we go to more extremes. I mean, you can get some roughness that's interesting, but it's not the same thing you can get from a fully destroyed piece that you're going to digitize yourself to create that function. So, like I said, distressing is really a function of how much we want to render that stuff. We ask ourselves, do we render it or not? Honestly, when we have things that look like they are scraped, like they are worn down, then what we're really looking for is show through most of the time. The other thing you could do, and I could have done on that piece, depending on the colors that I'm working with, you can use lighter top densities and draw things underneath that top layer to vary that density, especially if you lighten up the density quite a lot and then you draw underneath, leaving certain areas open and adding more density to other layers in the underlay layer. Now, this is a manual piece, not underlay, not an underlay setting. You can create dotted and other kinds of textured patterns by layering multiple layers of lower density materials. And truthfully, by manually drawing in the areas that are heavy or manually leaving out pieces that you want to show through. So reduce and randomize your density. Definitely look at randomizing your textures. If you have breaks in your type that you want, breaks in your objects, then you're going to have to physically break up the objects. That art that I showed you is made out of multiple pieces. Edge quality, you can certainly do things like use feathering and the jagged edge. But ultimately, you're going to be moving around control points and drawing in the larger chunks if you want them to work out. Randomness and fill texture is great. Hand stitch options are great. But when we get down to the point of having breaks in the type, breaks in the objects that are there in front of us, or if we have drips, trailers, and strings, like I showed you before, usually this is going to be done by multiple layers of straight stitch elements when they're super thin, satin stitch elements if you want big globby drips and strings, and by drawing elements in or leaving pieces out purposefully. That's usually how it's going to be. I mean, and it really depends because some textures you render more or less of, and it kind of depends on what your big deal is for whatever particular piece of art. One of the pieces I'm going to show that I've shown many times before is this piece I did for Chambers. It's a Netflix show that I did, and this piece honestly did have some of the stuff that I would consider kind of like distressing. Sometimes the stuff that we consider shading, I almost would consider distressed. If we look at this piece here, you can see that I didn't render all of it, but it did have some of this scraping kind of look. It had some textures and lines. It had, multiple kinds of edge treatments. We had kind of some bleed over. Not all of this was stuff we wanted to render, but you can see that we have dots and pieces that are disconnected. We have lines and areas that look like they're scraped away. And if we look at the eventual rendering that I did, a lot of it is manual. Um, when we have this texture that's in here with all these multiple shapes, what am I using? Good old run stitch tool. I am skipping some of the lines because, as we know, if we fill in all of these little lines, I'm going to get, if I measure this piece, a solid fill. If I'm having the same number of lines of thread per millimeter as I would in the fill behind it, I'm going to fully cover the area. So I'm reducing the amount of detail there and I'm leaving some spaces open. I'm using some random directions because one of the things we have the luck of is when we match directions with our fill underneath, things drop in and are reduced. When the cross and are at a different angle from the fill underneath, then those elements are going to stand out and be more bold. Longer stitches are going to stand up, shorter stitches are going to sink down. We can use that to our advantage, but you can see that where I go into some of the areas of larger shading, of denser shading, I have both changed direction on top of the fill. You can see that I am going a different direction from the fill underneath and I am going denser, but this is still all done. This is all run stitch detail. So all the stuff that's in here, all of these elements that we're looking at, this is all run stitch detail. This is manually drawn. And depending on where you're at, you can see, there's the fill that's behind it. But if we grab this piece, those are nodes. I'm drawing all of that. That is something that's being done by hand. And by the way, we talked about digitizing tools in a previous episode. This is the kind of work for which using a drawing tablet or a pen can be very handy. Work like this, where a lot of what we're doing is drawing back and forth. This is not something that I'm rendering with a columnar fill. I'm not using any other kind of textures or different kinds of fills. I am using a single straight stitch, or I'm using manual stitches to render these pieces. But what you can see is, even though I'm drawing all these pieces in, I'm not being tremendously slavish to the art. I am separating objects out into multiple pieces. I am using different kinds of textures for different areas. So in here, if I've got a piece that straight stitch makes sense for these lines, that's awesome. All of this is done straight, or you might even consider this zigzag, but it's more like manual stitching. But then when I get out into the fully dark filled edge out here, and I'm accidentally drawing in an extra angle point, you can see that I'm using a nice satin stitch around the edge. And I've also decided that trying to make any more roughness happen, there's a fairly smooth edge. I'm not using any roughness on that outer satin stitch. But some of the stuff we've also decided not to render. I actually decided not to render this bleed out of the fill. You could have. You would just do it in layers. You would go ahead and stitch this red out before you stitch the rest of the black on top. In this case, I talked to them about it, and they wanted to have a fairly patch-like clean edge. So they decided against that bleed. Could you have done it? Absolutely. Just leave that out. Either leave out the chunk of the top fill that's here and use straight stitches along this line instead of using this fully satin edged fill, or you could also just have some bleed outside of the outlines by allowing some of the red from the initial fill to remain. In this case, we didn't do it. What you will also see as far as some of the distressing, because we have this texture that I'm insinuating with the shading that's here, I've also used some randomness in my texture. We've got a 24% randomness on a curved fill so that there are some textures involved in the red that's in the background. So you have to think about it as an entire piece. Where is the texture coming from? What is it supposed to look like? Are we going to draw things on the top? Yes, in this case, we decided to draw things on the top. It's not the same as some of those other pieces. We essentially used the directions of the stitches, nice short manual stitches, randomness in the way they're placed, randomness in the fills, differences in the texture underneath to create something that looks more distressed. But absolutely, other options are to do things like adding whip stitch textures, pardon me, adding whip stitch textures like I showed you earlier. Or if you're making your own pieces like this, you can absolutely uh, make pieces that are look very random. And part of the planning on this one, this is a USA Trapunto piece you can download free from the Embroidery site. This piece was really more about knowing about how dense my areas are. I've talked about this piece before. In this case, it's not distress so much as using roughness and just keeping things random in the initial drawing. I think the problem is most people come to this and they understand that you've drawn this out. I have lots of people who come from kind of a graphic arts background who think that they bring in a clean flag vector and then go into their embroidery software and press a button and we zhuzh the piece up and it turns out like this. And I'm like, no, what we really have here is me drawing this piece. That's me dropping those control points. The control points you see are the ones that I drew. This is not a fill that's been engineered. These are straight stitches, run stitches that have been worked on in order to produce these different shapes. And as you can see, this is not one red chunk of fill. These are several pieces of run stitch that are put together so that I can control the exact output that I'm getting. I think that's probably the biggest thing to take away from this is a lot of this distressing is done by drawing the pieces the way that you want it. If we look at all these distressed pieces that are here, yes, some of this is automatically done, but when we get into full destroyed pieces, we may have 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces to make up what looks like one stroke in a standard letter in a standard shape. So, like I said, it is a question of whether or not we render it. In all honesty, as you've seen, many of the logos that I've done, we render them the first time like this. We take chunks out of them, we work them over, we have drawn elements and connectors and jump stitches and drips and drabs, and it doesn't work out in the end. Because a lot of the time, especially if it's just some jaggedness or some roughness on the edge of a satin stitch letter, at small sizes, it just reads like your embroidery didn't sew very well. In fact, that's the funny thing. I actually brought up a graphic, and I'm going to bring this up for you guys to make this point. When I first did this piece, and there's a piece that I did for my wife, it is a tote bag done on a very, very heavy canvas made of bamboo, incredibly dense, thick, rough weave. And as you can see, I am getting stair stepping all around this piece. Did I digitize this piece for stair stepping to have this much texture in those strokes? Absolutely not. I did not. This was not intentional. I was getting stair stepping because this is some of the slubbiest, roughest material I've used in a tote bag. Super rough tote bag, and I did not try and make any sort of consideration to make this work. I used the same needle I was using for everything else. It was tone on tone, and for me, I thought, you know what? The roughness is fine. It matches the look. For me, this can be seen as a kind of distress. It is distressed in the edges. The edges don't look perfect. There's some blockiness, some roughness in this piece. It's fine. If I attempted to make it, attempting to make this would be an incredible amount of drawing and work to make it look like something I stitched on rough texture material. If you're trying to make it happen, it's a lot harder to make it happen in a way that makes sense. But if we look at some of these other pieces that I've done that were intentionally distressed, loose densities, textured stitches, whip stitches, jagged edges, just like when you're trying to make handwork. Handwork and distressed work are similar in some ways. Certainly, we can do things with materials. I showed you the Keller Williams piece done by Stalls. I've done several either hand cut or plotter cut appliques that have a rough edge that once they wash, they get curled edges, rough edges. And this one's a reverse applique where I've got a piece of lighter colored jersey underneath a heavier, darker colored jersey that's on the top end. They get a little rippled. They aren't perfect, but because it's a rough cut piece, the great thing is some of that distress is forgiven. Um, Other than that, some of these other distressed pieces, it's really hard to tell what is intentional and what is not at small sizes. And part of that issue can be that the customer may think they want this piece with all the distressing on it, but when they finally see it in person, and especially when someone else sees it that isn't familiar with their logo, it just looks like a bad version. It just looks like the density is bad. It looks like it's unraveling. Very different when you're adding elements. Drips, stringers, things that are different with the shape, textures, totally cool. I think they're useful if you are trying to get the hand style look, some jagged edge work, Some multi-pass satins or some whip stitch style satins like the ones you're seeing here are awesome. Also, in this piece, I always complain about how white on dark stitching, either bean or chain stitching, like you're seeing here, looks stitchy. If that's the intent, that you want it to look like rough, semi-destroyed embroidery, you can use it to your advantage. Use the shadows that are between stitch penetration points to make it look rougher, to make it look more enhanced, that we have texture and stitches involved. These are all ways we can make it look good, and it can work out for us. And in fact, in this piece, I really wish I had a better version of this. I'm gonna have to find myself a better version of this picture. It did work. The looseness in the R, the pieces that were missing in it, the eventual textures that we got out of that, when we looked at the eventual piece, it really did speak to the version of that semi-destroyed, heavily distressed applique, and it did match with the style to the point that it was a successful piece that sold for quite a long time, and it didn't look out of place, despite the fact that we didn't do a tremendous amount of work to make that happen. We can go halfway. But like I said, it's really a judgment call for you. It depends on how it looks for your final piece. Sometimes materials can be involved. Sometimes we can use different settings, but ultimately it has to be a decision of what it's doing to the eventual look and what's the most important. Is the artistic complement important to you? Is the component of having some roughness make sense to the brand enough that it's something you want to mess with? And if so, do we need every line, chunk, drip, drab to show up? Do we need all the internal voids to be there? Or can we hint at it with a portion of what's in the art, very much like you saw me do in the Chambers logo? Can we hint at the texture and then add some unique textures, unique to embroidery, things like the randomization in the fill, if you have a hand stitch motif or a hand stitch use in your piece, or if you guys remember back when I talked about the textured fill, where I did that whole the piece that was done very much like we see kind of the faux chenille done recently, which looks in my mind less like chenille and more like a randomized stitch pattern, which I think is still very cool, where we use different stitch directions. If is we can use textures like that to enhance the look of something being a little distressed, or at the very least not as mechanical as a full density satin stitch, as a full density standard fill that has full coverage. So we can lighten density, use some randomization, and we just get something that looks less mechanical, and that may be enough to hint at that. Don't get me wrong. There are places where you're going to have logotypes that people absolutely need the breaks. There's a point to it. It's part of a motif. It has something to do with the branding. It has something to do with the name of the company you're working with or the team you're working with. And when that is the case, they're usually going to put their foot down on it. When it is not the case, when it is like we talked about with Mike, where it is a treatment rather than something that is integral to the design, it doesn't help recognition. It's not part of the design. It's more like just something they did to play up the texture. You're going to find people drop it. That New Mexico True logo, that is a perfect example. Yes, their print materials still have that roughness. New Mexico is a desert place that is rough and full of mountains and deserts and rough textures and stone and sandstone. And we wanted to get that feeling. That's great in print. Truthfully, as an embroidery piece for someone who's identifying themselves from the New Mexico Tourism Board, not nearly as important for that to look like weathered sandstone as it is for the print materials, for the flyers, for the brochures, and other things. We have to think about the purpose of the piece to make the most sense of it. So let's go with a couple different comments before we get done with this. And I love some of these, by the way. Justin says, happy accident, Bob Ross. Absolutely. Happy accidents can be wonderful. And like I said, if you're making a piece yourself and you're designing it, nobody knows. If I say this is a piece that is intended to look rustic, this is a piece that is intended to look coarse, would you have known if I didn't tell you? So, like we talked about on the half today, if you missed the half, something that Mike said, and I really agreed with, and everybody kind of came on the same side of this, Justin as well. Don't be so hard on yourself. Sometimes that look is good. This piece looks great. In person, this bag looks awesome. And I had to play up the colors on this in Photoshop to make it a little bit less tonal to get the shine on it. But the texture on this piece is cool. It looks great. There's nothing wrong with it. I was livid at how it was coming out when it was selling. I was not happy at the breaks and the texture. I did want it to be loose and rough. I did not want it to be pixelated. And to me, this looks almost like pixel art in some sections where that heavy, coarse weave caused those disruptions. But truthfully, yeah, happy accidents, folks. Happy accidents are fine. And once again, like I always say, It looks stitchy. It's made of stitches. Of course, it's going to look like that. The good thing is with distressing, the cool thing we can do is specifically recommend dark garments with light stitching on top, and we can use these shadows that are in embroidery, unique to embroidery, not a part of print. The shadows and the texture and the shine and shadow that is natural to our medium to enhance the distressed look. All right. With that, folks, we're going to go ahead and let that be the show. I would love to do some more detailed dives on some of this stuff, maybe show you guys more technique based stuff, but I hope that some of this sunk in as far as what I think about distress textures. I'm never going to be a fan of Papyrus, but I think you can totally do some distress text. Just remember, if you have holes, chunks, chips that have to be out of a certain area in a letter, in a design, you're going to be drawing those. If you have big breaks and voids, there's a high chance you're going to have to break something up into multiple pieces. And when it's intentional, one of the great things we can do is think about what the actual wear and tear would look like on a piece and emulate it. Like I said before, something I didn't really get into today because I didn't have a handy sample I could show you were things like showing what a letter would look like if it actually unraveled. What would it look like if the underlay is still there? We've all trimmed out or ripped out a stitch on purpose because we had to get a piece out. What would it look like if we intended for that to happen, and then design pieces where the treatment makes sense? Because a lot of the stuff you see for print, why does it look like that? Well, what did we see in those types, right? I'm going to show this set of types one more time from DeFont, from where everybody goes to get those fonts, who isn't really a designer. What are the things that we're seeing, right? We're seeing a print that's rubbed to the point where pieces are coming off. We're seeing a process print that was printed with not enough ink or lightly, and so we're seeing dots in it, or if we're zoomed in on it, that the process of the print, the way it was printed, is showing. We're seeing something that looks cracked as if it was bent, folded over time at the ink was starting to crack off. We're seeing processes in place. What we can do that's interesting in embroidery is show processes that embroidery would take, use rough threads, threads that have rough textures, very much like when I talked about hand worked stuff. Use threads that have rough textures to look like things that have taken wear. Actually use blended threads that are fuzzy and rub areas of the design the same way we would do for fuzzy animals. Rough them up a little bit, launder them so that they look destroyed and distressed. Tear off pieces of applique that are partially cut so that we get strings on purpose. We can do things that make a piece look distressed, and we can make a cool retail styled look. And we're doing something that makes more sense with the way a lot of these things are designed. They're designed to look like they rubbed off, like they're distressed, like they wore out. And that's something that's interesting to me and artistic, and we can do it in our embroidery in different ways. What's not interesting to me is representing the same old chunked up edges that repeat letter to letter on a font that's distressed. That is not interesting to me. What is interesting to me is the cool textures we can achieve if we think about the way things really degrade. All right, with that, folks, I'm going to go ahead and let that be the episode. We'll probably do something else on this at some other point. I think a lot of this boils down to the same things that always comes down to. You want something that looks a little less processed. You're going to have to get down there and draw, but don't be afraid, because there is much more room for you to play and less judgment involved than you think on the part of the consumer. And also, hey, don't take it personally. You may find, like I did, that your first guess at trying to make something like this work, especially when it's outside of the wheelhouse of your usual work, does not please the customer. Go on to the next guess, go on to the next try, give yourself some space to be unhappy if you liked the original version better. But we know that we're serving a purpose, and we know that we're serving a clientele, especially we're in the business side of this thing. Make pieces for yourself that serve your own needs. And when you make pieces for other people, don't take it personally. Try things out and let each experiment have its own little happy accidents and be its own part of the learning process. With that, folks, love to hear more from you. Love to hear more of your stories. And if you have something you'd like to see on the next week's show, drop some comments in and let me know. And I cannot wait to do this again for you guys next